Hey guys, it's Makeshift, and today I'm going to share some tips on how to align your embroidery on your pattern pieces. So on this pattern here, I've aligned the eyes, the eyebrows, and the mouth. I do rely heavily on a printer and scanner and my embroidery machine to do a lot of the work for me, but there are a lot of tips in this video that you could use even if you are making your design by applique or even doing some embroidery by hand. The first tip I have is to place your design on a piece of fabric that is larger than your pattern piece. So you can see on my head pattern here, this cut of fabric that I'm going to embroider the face onto is larger than my pattern piece itself. And I give about 1/4 of an inch to 1/2 an inch extra space here. If you're new to doing this, you might want to allow for a little bit more room. And I'm kind of cutting it close here, but that was done on purpose because the muzzle is going to be appliqued a different color. So I'm actually going to be adding fabric around this area during my embroidery process, so I don't need to have extra fabric in this space. But if this was going to be all just one single color for my pattern, then this fabric cut would be larger all around this area here. Even though it results in more fabric waste, you're going to overall save fabric in the end because it's a lot easier to do your embroidery or your applique on a larger fabric piece and then cut it down to size rather than cutting your fabric piece exactly to size and then trying to perfectly place your embroidery onto that cut pattern piece. I used to do that in the very beginning when I started making plushies, and it's just very easy to get your embroidery off by even just a little bit, like 1/8 of an inch can be noticeable in some designs where it just ends up being asymmetrical. So I highly recommend starting with a larger piece of fabric and doing your embroidery or your applique onto that, and then once you're done, you can cut out your pattern piece from that. If you have your own embroidery program and you have a printer as well, you can do an extra step where you print out a template like this to help you further line up your pattern piece. So what I've done here is I've printed out the embroidery design of the face, and then I've traced the head pattern onto that printed piece of paper. And on my embroidery program, I have the option to print out this aligning square here. So this little square tells me exactly where the center of my design is. So I can transfer this center piece onto my fabric for when I go ahead and hoop that to do my embroidery. If you don't have a printer, you can figure this out yourself, but it might be a little bit more difficult. This is another reason why I find my printer so valuable in plush making, is for doing embroidery. It's just a lot easier for me to print out my designs to center them onto my fabric rather than having to do that work myself. If you don't have a printer, you could draw out your own template by drawing out your design and then drawing the pattern around it, but you need to be careful about making sure that your embroidery is the correct size and everything is the correct placement that you want it as well. And by having a template like this, once you're done with your embroidery, you can trace it onto the fabric and then cut it out from there. And being able to line up your eye or your other design with your template is another way to make sure that everything comes out even in the end. And I do one extra step to ensure that my embroidery comes out even, which is to trace the outline of my pattern piece if I can in my embroidery design itself. So I'm going to jump over to Embird to show you what I mean.
So here in Embird, I've pasted in a scanned picture of my pattern, and all I've done is I've scanned it and then I took it into my photo editing software, which I just use GIMP, which is free, and I've selected the pattern as large as my hoop can take. So on my hoop, I can fit a 5.12 by 7.09 size object. So I just made a box that size and then put it around my pattern piece, and I tried to put as much of the pattern as I can in this area. So on the left here, I'm not able to capture all of my pattern piece, but that's okay. You just want to get as much as you can. Even a small amount will help you line up the object when you go to cut it out later on when you're done with your embroidery. So I just copied this photo here and then I pasted it into Embird. And depending on your embroidery software, this might be a different process, but if you have a scanner, it's really helpful to go ahead and scan your pattern in. And if you can get where you want the eye design to line up or whatever else you're embroidering, that's even better because now I know exactly where this eye design needs to line up on my pattern piece. So from here, you can go ahead and design your eye embroidery, and you can check out another video of mine if you need tips on how to do that in Embird, but that's not in the scope of this tutorial. But the last thing you want to do is to go ahead and outline your pattern piece with just a running stitch object. So I do include seam allowance in my pattern pieces. If you don't, this might be a little bit difficult for you because I cut out exactly where my seam allowance is going to be. So if you don't like to include seam allowance in your pattern pieces, then you might want to just go ahead and skip this step. But in Embird, you just want to select this here, which is the create outline object, and it's just going to be a simple straight stitch. And so what I do is just trace around the edge of my pattern piece, and you want to have your scans where you can easily see where it ends. So if you're scanning a white piece of paper on a white background, it might be too difficult to see. But you just make the outline object by clicking every so often and then moving the little circle piece in between. And then just go to the very end of your pattern piece, which, like I said, mine cuts off here. My hoop is too small to encompass this whole pattern piece. And then hit check mark, and now you'll have a straight stitch. So I typically stitch this out at the very end of my object, so I will embroider everything else, and then I'll finish up by having it stitch this outline around my embroidery, and that way I can just cut it out directly on this outline, and I don't have to do any other lining up. But in this case, where my pattern goes beyond the hoop, I will have to do some more centering with my template, but since I have the majority of it already lined up, it's going to be pretty easy to do. So to show you what that looks like, you can see the outline of the head here, and that's just going to be a straight stitch. That is the very last thing that is stitched here in this box of the order of objects. And so this will help me further line up my embroidery exactly.
So with my template printed out, I have my centering square printed out as well. I've just punctured some holes into the edges here so that I can take a water soluble or a disappearing ink fabric marker and mark where the center is, and I just mark the very center, and then I mark the 4 edges as well. Then I come up with this set of dots here that will help me to align my hoop. My hoop comes with these grids to help me line up my fabric with where my embroidery is centered, and yours should come with something similar. So this center dot should line up with this big center here, and then the 4 dots around the center will line up with the square edges around it. So here I have my stabilizer, so I'm going to spray it with basting adhesive to help my fabric stick. So I'm going to take my fabric with the points, and I'm going to get the center mark generally in the center of the stabilizer. And my stabilizer size is a bit larger than my hoop, so I don't have to get it exact, but if I end up hooping this and I am pretty uneven, then I can just recenter this fabric. And if you need some help on hooping your fabric beyond this short tutorial here, you can check out my video on how to hoop fabric if you need it. So now I have my hoop with the bottom, I have the top here, and I'm going to take the grid and place it on my hoop. I'm going to take the centering grid and line it up exactly with my dots. So this will be a bit hard to see, but you can see beneath this grid that the dots are going to line up with the centering grid of this hoop here. So you don't want this to be too far off. It doesn't have to be exact, and that's because we did cut this fabric larger than the pattern piece itself. If you did cut your fabric exactly, you would have to perfectly line up these dots and then get it in the hoop, and then everything has to line up exactly for your pattern piece to come out centered. And that to me is just not worth the saved fabric, so that's why I cut my fabric larger than it's going to be in the end, because it's going to end up shifting a little bit when I get this into the hoop. And again, a little bit of shifting is fine. I don't want a whole lot, but if it was cut down to your actual pattern piece, then it has to be exact. So now I'm going to grip this from the sides, pull up the stabilizer with it, and get it in my hoop. And now that it's in with this grid still on top, my dots have become a little off center, which I'll show you. You can see how the dots are beside this line now, and that's okay because of my extra fabric, but if this was cut down to size, then that is not going to be okay. So you're going to have to continually hoop this until you get it exact, but because I have a lot of wiggle room on my pattern, I don't need to do that. So now I can go ahead and execute my embroidery, and then once it's done, we can continue cutting it out of the fabric and get it perfectly lined up for even eyes. So I have both of my pattern pieces embroidered now. The applique is done, the embroidery is done, and so now I am ready to go ahead and cut the actual pattern piece out of this fabric. And I want to get it perfectly lined up with the embroidery so that it is even and all the designs are aligned on both sides. Now, regardless of what method you use to get your eyes or your design onto your fabric, whether you did embroidery or whether you did applique or maybe even did some embroidery by hand, this is where you would want to have a template to line up your design with your pattern piece. So even though I've done some extra work in my embroidery program by stitching the outline of my pattern piece where I want to cut this out, you don't have to have that, but you would want to have a template at this point so that you can easily figure out where you want your design to be when cutting it out. So I'm just going to take one of my face sides and trace my template onto that. Because I did the extra stitch lines on my embroidery, I have an easy guide to line up my template with, but if you didn't have that, you could go ahead and just use your template with however you drew your design on it, whether you printed this out with your embroidery program or if you just freehanded it and drew it onto your template. You want to line up your design on the paper with your actual fabric. So if I didn't have the outline, I would want to line up the mouth with the mouth itself, and of course the eye, and then make sure that you're looking on the actual design to make sure that it lines up with the fabric underneath. But because I have this handy outline, it's very easy for me to line up my template with my fabric. So I do like to trace on the stabilizer rather than on the fabric, just because the fabric can kind of bunch up a little bit in the areas where it's been embroidered and stitched down with the outline stitch. And I prefer to draw on to the stabilizer with my air soluble marker because it's not going to transfer onto the fabric, which means I don't have to worry about taking it off. And I just find it a little bit easier to see the stitch marks on the stabilizer, even though you guys might have a harder time seeing it because it's white on white. So I'm going to take my template and align it with my outline, and I want the stitches to line up exactly on the edge of my pattern. And then I'm going to trace where my stitches end, because again, my embroidery hoop was not large enough to fit the whole pattern piece. So now I have a drawn line that makes up for the rest of my pattern piece. So now I can cut along my drawn line and along the stitch marks. So I do use my non-fabric scissors for this purpose because I am cutting through stabilizer as well, but that's not necessary, but it will dull your fabric scissors a little bit faster if you cut through stabilizer with your fabric scissors. And I'm going to cut on the inside of my marker line because it is thick and my pattern should line up with the inside of this traced line. So now I have my pattern piece cut out. And you can take the stabilizer off of the back. I always use cutaway, so I do have to cut it away. And with the outline stitches, you'll find that some of the stitches can get caught on the edge. And usually if you just give it a tug, it'll pull right off. But sometimes I'll have to take a seam ripper to the stitches. So for the other side, I'm going to repeat this process, but one other technique that I've used in the past is to do that technique with one side and then use your cut pattern piece on top of the other one to mirror it that way. So if you wanted to do this, you would take your first cut pattern piece and then lay it on top of the second one with the right sides together, and now you can line up your embroidery by laying it on top of each other. So I'm just going to do this roughly, but you just want to lay it down and make sure everything's lining up. And then you could trace this on top of your second pattern piece, but this is considerably less precise than my method of using a template and tracing it onto both sides, because you have to get it exact when lining up your embroidery on top of each other. You should probably also pin it together and then making sure that everything isn't shifting around when you're tracing it on top of each other. So I'm just going to go ahead and trace my template onto my second pattern piece and cut it out, and then we can take a look. And so here are my two pattern pieces completed. They are nice and even. The embroidery is aligned on the pattern exactly. All the aspects are lining up on both sides for the eyes, for the eyebrows, and for the mouth. So when I go ahead and sew this together, I don't have to worry about the eyes being uneven on either side, and it'll just give the plush a more professional look when everything is nice and symmetrical as intended. So hopefully you can use some of these tips on your own projects, and thanks for watching. See you next time.